Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Great Leadership. My guest today is Charles Duhigg. He's the best-selling author of several books, including The Power of Habit, which was 3 years on the New York Times bestseller list. Second book came out called Smarter, Faster, Better, and his third book out now is called Supercommunicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. He currently writes for the New Yorker magazine, and he's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who lives in Santa Cruz, and I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz. So we share the banana slugs in common.
Exactly. And fond memories of Redwood Forest.
Yes. So today, a couple things that I wanted to go over. Obviously, the book is really focused on how to understand communication, how to become a good communicator. So we're going to look at why you wrote the book, what it means to be a super communicator. We're going to go over the different types of conversation. Learning conversations, the 3 mindsets that you talk about in the book: decision-making, emotional, and social, the role of leaders when it comes to being a super communicator, and then we'll go over the 4 rules of meaningful conversations, something called looping for understanding, and then in the leaders toolkit section at the very end, we're going to go over how to actually put some of these ideas into practice, looking at the conversation in different pieces before, at the beginning, as it unfolds, and how we can actually make these things come to life. So Charles, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So how far away are you from the University of California, Santa Cruz? I'm curious.
So I'm like probably about 10 miles from there.
Really?
So relatively close, yeah.
So you hang out in like Capitola and all those fun spots?
I do. My wife and I both surf. So we spend a lot of time in Capitola because there's a great break there. And then we also surf in Santa Cruz proper.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, so let's jump right into the book and why you actually decided to write this, because your first book was about the power of habit. None of them were really, I guess maybe they touched on communication, but not to the extent that this one does. So why communication? Why now?
Well, a couple of things happened. The first is that the power of habit is really, and Smarter, Faster, Better are really about how do I improve myself, right? But as I started thinking about it more and more, I realized much of our life is not spent just with ourselves, and it's not spent focusing on ourselves. The things that matter a lot in a happy and productive life, particularly to leaders, is how we relate to other people. And so once I started thinking about that, I realized that communication is this incredibly important part of anyone's toolkit for success. But then I also had a couple of experiences, which was, at work, they asked me to become a manager. And I thought, I can definitely do that. I've had bosses my whole life. I went to Harvard Business School. I'm going to be great at this. And I was like great at the logistics part and terrible at the communication part, which totally bewildered me because I communicate for a living. And I was trying to figure this out. And I started reflecting about, this thing that happened with my wife a lot, which I'm sure is probably familiar to you and many of the people who are listening, which is that oftentimes I would come home from work after having a tough day and I would like start complaining to my wife and I'd be like, my boss is a jerk and my colleagues don't appreciate me and nobody understands how smart I am. And my wife, in a very rational, very wise manner, would give me some practical advice. She would say like, look, why don't you invite your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better. And then, you can kind of work from there. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would basically become even more upset. I would be like, why aren't you listening to me? Like I want you to take my side. I want you to be outraged on my behalf. And she, of course, when I started overreacting like that, would also get upset and be like, it's not my fault you had a bad day. Like, why aren't you taking good advice?
Yeah.
And this would happen not all the time, right? But it would happen enough that I wanted to understand what was going on there, why we were failing to connect with each other when we both honestly wanted to. And so I started calling up all these experts, neurologists and psychologists, and asking them.
And so just to be clear, when you talk about communication, obviously there's a lot of aspects of communication, right? There's the words, there's your body language, there's your tone, there's, are you asking follow-up conversations? So what are the different elements that go into this aspect of being a super communicator, and what is a super communicator?
So the first big insight, and this is kind of what the researchers told me when I first talked to them, was we are accustomed to thinking of discussions as one thing, right? We're talking about where to go to dinner, where to go on vacation next year, or I'm trying to tell you a story about my boss, or we're trying to figure out why Jimmy keeps on getting bad grades. But the truth of the matter is that every single discussion is made up of multiple different kinds of conversations. And oftentimes, most of these conversations, they fit into one of three big buckets. There are these practical conversations where our goal is really to figure out what we want to talk about and then to solve a problem or to come up with a plan or to just kind of figure out like what's the next step. But then there are other kinds of conversations where I might bring up something about emotions, and my goal is not to have you fix my problem. My goal is to have you just acknowledge my problem or
Yeah.
acknowledge how I'm feeling or share how you're feeling, right?
That's
These
a
are
common
emotional
one with
conversations.
my wife, right? Where she will share something and I feel like I have the solution and the answer to fix it. And
Exactly.
she'll say,
Exactly.
I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to hear what I'm saying. So
That's exactly
I'm
right.
working on that one.
So she's having an emotional conversation and you're having a practical conversation,
Yeah.
right? And there's this third kind of conversation known as the social conversation, which is about how we interact with each other and how we interact with the world and the world sees us. And what researchers have discovered is that most miscommunication occurs because we're having different kinds of conversations. So when you
Mhm.
talk to your wife and you try to solve her problem, she's having an emotional conversation with you. She wants you to hear how she feels. You're in a practical mindset. You try and solve her problem. Neither of you guys are really hearing each other. Or when I came home from work and I was upset about my boss, I was in an emotional conversation and my wife responded with a practical conversation. And that mismatch meant that we couldn't really communicate with each other. We couldn't connect.
Hmm.
So within psychology, there's this thing known as the matching principle, which says that in order to have connection occur, in order to communicate fully, you need to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, either practical, emotional, or social. And you need to match each other. You need to match the other person and invite them to match you.
Hmm.
And if you do that, and this is what super communicators do consistently, because we're all super communicators at one time or another, but people who are consistently super communicators, they've learned this instinct to look for what kind of conversation is happening and then match the other person.
That's interesting. So I guess I'm trying to think of like, let's say my wife comes to me with or I go to my wife with a emotional conversation. Oh, I don't feel good. I'm having a bad day, this and that. And she starts off with a practical conversation and it's not going well. So I guess there's a way that you can then pivot so you can kind of move between them. It's almost like I'm thinking of Marvel movies, right? Where Doctor Strange moves between different universes. And
Different universe,
so
yeah.
it's kind of like that where you're kind of in one and you wave your hand a little bit and you move into the other universe, which is kind of the one that you're supposed to be. Like that's the visual that's popping into my head.
I think that's a good visual. And what's important about that is that it could be that you match your wife
Okay.
or that you know how to invite your wife to match you, right? Because it's not like you have to follow other people's lead all the time. And then what's important is that once you are aligned, what in psychology and neurology is known as neural entrainment, once you and your wife are having the same kind of conversation at the same time, then you'll actually start to move from different kind of conversation to different kind of conversation together.
Okay.
It's all about getting aligned at first.
Okay.
And there's a really easy way sometimes to think about this or to even ask the other person, which is in schools now, they teach teachers that if a student comes up and they're upset or they just have something important they want to discuss, that the teacher should ask them, do you want me to hear you? Do you want me to help you? Or do you want me to hug you?
Ah.
And these three things, these are the three different kinds of conversations I just mentioned, right? Practical, emotional, and social. And simply by asking that, oftentimes the other person says what they need out of that conversation. And you can say back as easily you've told me that you want me to help you and I want to do that. Let's do that. And then I want to just hug you. I want to tell you that like you belong here. You're doing okay. It's the same thing that happens when your wife says to you, I don't need you to solve my problem. I just need you to listen to me. She's telling you what kind of conversation she
Yeah.
wants at that moment. And you can easily respond by saying, I want to start by listening. And then if it's okay with you, like I'd love to talk about solutions. And you're saying what you want out of it. And as long as you're aligned, you're going to be able to hear each other.
So why is this relevant in a work setting? So, we've been talking a lot about husband and wife. Let's say I'm a leader of a team, leader of a function or a business. Can you give me maybe an example of how this might manifest in kind of in a workplace setting?
Absolutely. And I think anyone who's listening knows that the conversations you have with your spouse are not so different from the conversations you have
There's a lot
with
of
your colleagues,
similarities, yes.
right? Yeah. So there was this big experiment that was done, or a kind of cool experiment that was done, where these researchers went into an investment bank. And this bank was like, it was like the most cutthroat place on earth, right? People inside the bank were competing with each other for deals. They were competing for bonuses. It was not untypical for literally half of the meetings in this bank to end in screaming matches. And
Sounds like
people
a great
just
place to
like,
work.
yeah. I mean, they made a lot of money, so I guess they could put up with it. So these researchers come in and they're like, look, okay, we're going to try something. What we want you to do is, they said this to everyone in the firm. Before every meeting, before you walk into the room, we want you to sit down or just pull out a note card or a scrap of paper and just jot down two things. Write one sentence with two things in it. Just say, what's your goal for this meeting? And what kind of mood do you hope that the meeting will have?
Okay.
And when they looked at people, people wrote down stuff like, the goal for this is for all of us to like agree on a budget for next year. And I want everyone to feel like they've been heard, like they've had a voice in this, so they all buy in. Or they would say things like, I'm going to go talk to Maria and ask her if she wants to come on vacation with me, but I want to make it easy for her to say no. I don't want it to feel like it's like a big like pressure situation. So everyone writes these down, then they stick them in their back pocket. Most people don't share with anyone else what they've written down. Sometimes they start the meeting by saying, here's my goal and here's the mood, but most people don't. And they found that conflicts inside the firm went down 80%. Literally people were fighting 80% less with each other. Not because they all of a sudden agreed with each other, not because they stopped competing. All of those dynamics were still there. People still walked away feeling like that other guy's a jerk. But because they knew what their goal was, what they hoped to achieve in the conversation, and by writing down the mood, they knew what kind of conversation they wanted to have. It gave everyone a lot of clarity about how to have this conversation in a productive way. Because the truth of the matter is, when we are screaming at each other, we are not communicating. And the whole point of a meeting is to communicate.
Yeah.
And so simply by teaching people to identify what kind of conversation is happening and what they hope to bring to it, you actually make workplace communication better.
What did you say the impact of that was? I think you mentioned a stat, but it kind of cut out there for a second.
80% of conflicts, the
Wow.
rate of conflicts went down 80%. Right.
That's
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, that's massive. So no more screaming and shouting at each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, like, it's not like everyone suddenly was like friends or they were like, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But what they were doing is they were clear on what they wanted to say, and they were able to listen to what other people wanted to say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And ultimately, that's the goal of communication.
I learned something absolutely insane today. 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed to it. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. It'll take you just 1 second and it helps the channel quite a bit. You'll also get access to new videos when they are released. Hit that subscribe button, and now let's get back to the content. So what are the flags that help you identify what kind of conversation you're having? Because obviously if I'm a leader, or actually even if I'm not a leader, even if I'm an employee and I'm having a conversation with my leader or with somebody else, being a super communicator seems like kind of a secret weapon. It seems like it can help you get ahead in conversations. It can help you resolve conflicts. It can help you get your ideas across. But part of that entails knowing what you're getting into, what conversation you're having, what conversation somebody else is having. So how do you spot the differences between those three?
So it's actually, once you know how what to look for, it's actually pretty easy. So, and the easiest way to do this is by asking a certain kind of question. So as I mentioned, everyone is a super communicator at some points, right? We've all had that experience where you go into the meeting and you know exactly what to say to like win the day, and everyone receives what you're saying like so enthusiastically. And then there's other times that you think you're going to knock it out of the park, and you try and it just doesn't work. Like you can't connect with anyone. They can't hear your idea. So we're all super communicators at certain times in our life. But for many of us, it feels like it almost happens like by chance or accidentally. What super communicators who are consistent super communicators do is they are able to sort of summon that on a more regular basis. And the number one thing that they do is they ask a certain kind of question. In fact, what we know about super communicators, consistent super communicators, is that they ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. But oftentimes we don't register the question because it's questions like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Or what'd you think about that? Or what'd you do next? Right? So what kind of question is the right kind of question to figure out what kind of conversation we're having? The answer is to ask a deep question. And a lot of this work comes from a guy named Nick Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, as well as a number of his colleagues in industry. A deep question is something that invites me to discuss my values, my beliefs, or my experiences. And in doing that, when I ask a deep question, what I'm essentially giving the other person a chance to do is to tell me what they care about, but also to express what they need out of this conversation, whether they want to have an emotional conversation or a practical conversation or a social conversation. And the thing about deep questions is they don't have to seem deep. They don't have to seem like overly intimate or personal. Like
tell me your deep secrets.
Yeah, that's a terrible question, right? Because nobody's going to want to answer that. But if you meet someone and they're like, "Oh, I'm a lawyer," and you're like, "Oh, did you always want to be a lawyer since you were a kid? Do you love practicing the law? Why'd you decide to go to law school?" Any one of those questions is actually a deep question. And it doesn't seem like a weird question to ask, right? But if I ask you, like, do you love the law? I'm inviting you to talk about your values. If I ask you why you decided to go to law school, I'm inviting you to talk about your past and your experiences. These are the kinds of questions that not only draw someone into a conversation, but also in how they respond, they're going to tell us what kind of mindset they're in, right? If somebody says, well, I decided to go to law school because I wanted to get a good job where I could earn enough money and take care of my family because my father wasn't always there for us. That person's in a practical mindset. They're talking about practical issues. But if in answer to the same question, they say, I went to law school because I just believe so deeply in justice and I saw all this injustice happening and I wanted to be part of solving it. That's an emotional conversation, right? They're telling us that they're really guided by their heart right now. Or they could say something social. They could say, look, I myself come from a minority. I saw that minorities were being impacted really harshly by the legal system. I wanted to go in there and I wanted to help people like me. That's a social conversation.
Yeah.
So once we know how to listen to the answer to that deep question, that's how we figure out what kind of conversation they want to have. And at that point, we can either match them or even better, we can match them and then invite them to match us.
And now in a business setting, right? I'm trying to think of just the various types of conversations you have, right? It's maybe performance management, it's talking about a project, going over deadlines, talking to a customer. I guess sometimes you will have those social conversations as well, right? That, the office cooler kind of talk.
A ton.
Yeah. So I'm assuming in that work kind of a context, then why is it important for you to know there? I mean, let's say we're in the office together, we're down the hall and we're kind of getting together to work on a project. How do you then approach that to identify, or why in that situation do you even need to know what kind of a conversation you're having with somebody else if you're talking about a project or a deadline or something? Like, how's that going to help?
So it could be super practical, right? It could be that you and I have done 20 projects before and we're going to have a conversation and we both know coming in, this is a practical conversation. We just got to figure out some logistics. Yeah. But most of the time you go into that room and it's someone you haven't worked with before, or you've only worked with a little bit. And there's a lot of other stuff going on besides logistics, right? Yeah. There's these political realities inside your firm. That's entirely social. There's a bunch of I know you've heard from friends that this person, they do a great job with writing, but you don't want to put them on a stage. So there's probably some emotional issues around how we're going to divvy up this stuff. I don't want you to feel offended if I say I'd like to take the lead in the presentation. We think about business as if it's actually logical and rational, But anyone who actually works in business knows it is sometimes, but a lot of the times it isn't.
Yeah.
And in fact, this social conversation, that happens all the time in business settings because we talk about office gossip. We talk about, we've got a plan. How are we going to get the other division to sign on to it? We talk about how the other division thinks our division are a bunch of, idiots, and like why are they such jerks to us? Those are all social conversations, or positive ones. I like that guy. I want him to be on our team. How do we get him over? Those are social conversations.
Yeah, I've been mentioning this on a few episodes. I'm just about done with Bob Iger's book. And he talks about several instances, for example, where he was negotiating with Steve Jobs. And now that I hear you talk about these three different types of conversations, he very much had that, right? Sometimes, when he was negotiating the acquisition of Pixar, when Bob Iger was at Disney originally, there was a lot of kind of the practical conversations of the logistics. How are we going to make this acquisition work? And then in his book, after the acquisition is about to take place, Bob Iger talks about a time when him and Steve Jobs are sitting together, and Steve Jobs puts his hand kind of around the back of where Bob Iger is sitting, and he tells him, hey, just so you know, I've been diagnosed with cancer. I probably don't have a lot longer left to live. So if you want to back out of this acquisition, let me know. And that's obviously much more of an emotional conversation. And
Absolutely.
And so in that situation, Bob's not going to talk about dollars and cents. It kind of shifts.
And Bob Iger, as a master communicator, super communicator, par extraordinaire, he knows that when Steve Jobs, think about how disastrous it would have been if Steve Jobs had said that and Iger said, oh, okay, well, in that case, what we need to do is we need to come up with a succession plan, and we need to make sure that your number 2 is in place. And we should probably talk about are we taking out corporate life insurance on you? That would have alienate anyone, right? But Iger, I'm certain, knew exactly what to do, which is to match Steve Jobs and sort of get emotional with him. There's a story in the book. So the book is basically made up of a series of case studies, stories from different places. And one of them is from Netflix. And it talks about how a few years ago, there was this big controversy inside Netflix because one of the senior executives used the N-word in a meeting.
Oh, yeah. I remember that from your book. Yeah.
Yeah. And he, of course, got fired, right? But it also set off this huge firestorm inside the company because suddenly some people were saying, Netflix is racist. This is a racist workplace. Other people were saying, no, it's not racist. You're only saying that because you can't compete here because you don't have what it takes. And it was really threatening to tear the company apart. And the way that Netflix handled this and actually made it from a threat into an actual strength is by having these social conversations. And one of the most important things in a social conversation is simply to acknowledge the identity of the other person, what they bring to the conversation. So oftentimes, we think about conversations about race, for instance, as being conversations where some people should talk and some people should listen. But study after study shows that actually doesn't work.
Yeah.
We have all had racial experiences. And if we don't acknowledge each other's racial experiences, then it's very hard to listen to each other. So it's really important to say to someone, look, you as an African American, as someone who's Black, you experience this workplace differently than I do, right? There are challenges that I don't think I can understand, but it's equally important for them to say, and you as someone who is white, but perhaps also a woman or a gay man or a lesbian, or maybe you're Hispanic, you have your own identity, or you're someone who cares deeply. You're an ally and you want to help. You have your own identity. And that means that you bring certain things to this conversation. It's our instinct sometimes to ignore or overlook differences. But in a social conversation, acknowledging them is really, really useful.
Yeah, this gets into the heart of a lot of DEI, right? Because there's a lot of debate now in DEI. And I actually put up something on LinkedIn fairly recently because Elon Musk, as I'm sure you saw, put up a tweet that said DEI must die. And it's really interesting now to see what's going on with this because there are, of course, people who talk about the benefits and the values of DEI. And there are others who are pointing to the fact that DEI may have gone so far to the other side that it actually feels like it is doing the very things that it was intended to stop doing, which is excluding people or making assumptions or creating more polarization or creating cultures of victimhood. So it's really interesting to see these two different sides, these discussions taking place, right, in this sphere of DEI. And I know in the book you talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, and I think I don't. The problem with DEI is it means like different things to different people. It's kind of unspecific. So like what I like to talk about is I talk about conversations that we can have with people about tough subjects, right? Like it doesn't
Charles,
matter if,
oh, there you
yeah,
are.
can you
Sorry, you
hear?
cut out there
Yeah.
for a minute.
Oh, sorry. I was saying
Yeah, you're back.
what I like to, so the tough thing about DEI is that it just means, I don't know what it means. Like it means different things to different people. It's kind of
It
unspecific,
is.
so what I like to talk about is I like to talk about having conversations with other people about tough subjects, right? So
Yeah.
like, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about race or you're talking about politics or you're talking about what raise you should get next week or or talking about what strategy you should use next year or where you're going to send your kid to school. When we go into these tough conversations where we know that other people might have different opinions or that we need to come together around a consensus, the rules are the same no matter what the topic of conversation is,
Yeah.
right? We need to have the same kind of conversation at the same time. We need to prove to each other that we are listening.
Yeah.
Because if I don't think you're listening to me, I'm not going to listen to you. If it seems like you're just waiting your turn to talk, then nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I like that approach much more because I agree. A lot of people talk about DEI differently. And honestly, even I get very confused because some people talk about it as, physical attributes. Other people talk about it in terms of cognitive diversity. Some people are here, some people are there. And it almost feels like a word that's being used and you don't know what people mean. Whereas if you just talk about it in terms of let's have difficult conversations, we should all be able to have difficult conversations. I think that's much more tangible,
Absolutely.
and it acknowledges that everybody has a different perspective and a viewpoint, and it kind of gets to a common place, right?
And by the way, like the point of a difficult conversation is not necessarily to agree with each other, but
Yeah.
but a difficult conversation only succeeds if we understand what the other person is saying. Right. And so let's say we are talking about race, which is like kind of spot on for DEI.
Yep.
If we think about it as just a challenging conversation that we ought to have, a challenging conversation we can both learn from, then our number one goal is to essentially learn from each other. It's not to convince each other like you're bad, I'm good, or it's not to convince anyone that like it's hard to do that in one conversation.
Yeah.
But if I understand where you're coming from and you understand where I'm coming from, we're probably going to find some places where we agree, and the places where we don't agree are going to be easier to talk about.
If you enjoy getting leadership and career advice and trying to figure out how to future-proof your organization, you are not going to want to miss heading over and subscribing to my Substack, which you can do by going to greatleadership.substack.com. We have a community there of tens of thousands of people from around the world, and it's where I share my latest thinking, my best ideas, exclusive interviews with CEOs, in-depth articles and insights that I share, and leadership hacks from some of the world's top leaders and best-selling authors. So if you want to really step up your leadership game, excel in your career, head over to greatleadership.substack.com. You are not going to want to miss this opportunity. What's to use traditional business speak, the ROI of being a super communicator, right? So,
Oh my God, it's huge.
People listening and watching this might be thinking, okay, got it. Match conversations, know what the conversations are. Why do I need to do this? Am I not going to be a leader if I don't do this? Am I not going to be as successful? Am I not going to be?
You probably won't be a leader, right? Being a leader is all about communication. But it's a good question, and what I would answer is this. So our capacity to communicate and our capacity to be super communicators has evolved within our brains. It's something that over millennia we've developed the capacity to do. And if you think about it, the reason why the human species has succeeded is because we can communicate. It is literally our superpower. Every other species cannot communicate as effectively as we can. And because we can build societies, we can share ideas. If I invent fire or a new video game, I can explain to you how to invent fire, how to create fire or a new video game. Communication means that an idea that's come up 1,000 years ago is still alive today because I can read it in a book. Communication is our superpower. And so when we're talking about like, why do people succeed as opposed to why does our species succeed? It's usually because they've learned how to communicate much more effectively than the people around them. And I know that it can feel overwhelming to be like, okay, I got to remember the 3 kinds of conversations. I got to do this and I got to do that. But the truth of the matter is that like you and I, all of us, we have these instincts inside our head. But those instincts evolved in a much different setting, right? Those instincts evolved over the last thousands of years. And we've been talking for a millennia. We've been writing each other letters that we kind of edit and perfect for 2000, at least 2000 years, if not longer. But we've only been talking on the internet since 1982. And we've only been texting each other since really like 1999, right? So one of the things that the book tries to do, that Supercommunicators tries to do, is it tries to show you how to understand what's going on so that you can unlock your instincts. You can let your instincts so that you don't have to think as much about communicating because you have these hardwired instincts in your brain. And part of it is just understanding how to let them free in today's world.
And the benefit of this is, so again, probably leadership development, team
Literally
building.
every single thing. I mean, when they look at studies of people who salaries and communication ability, they see a direct correlation.
Interesting.
When they look at studies of people who have succeeded by getting promotions within a particular company and communication, direct correlation. Number one correlation, actually, for promotive ability,
Wow.
unless you're in a strictly engineering capacity. So if you think about it, like marketing is communication. Management is communication. HR is communication. It's real safety is communication.
Yeah.
It's really only the guys who are like typing at their computer for 12 hours a day and don't need to talk to anyone else. And it turns out, Google has done studies on this, that if you can type for 12 hours a day and code really well, and you can communicate, you're going to get promoted faster and end up earning more money.
Well, now this makes me wonder about the difference between working from home versus working in an office, because I would imagine, I mean, a lot of communication isn't just like we talked about the words, but it's matching the conversation, it's body language. It's a lot more than just staring at a screen, right? I mean, if you and I were having this conversation at a coffee shop, it would probably be, it would probably talk about different things. It'd be easier. You know, I'd see your body language. We'd communicate more effectively as opposed to just doing this behind, a screen and a camera. Is there any relationship there as far as being a super communicator in person versus being a super communicator virtually?
Well, there's a difference in how you should think about it, right? And so you're exactly right. In fact, one of the chapters in the book is all about non-linguistic communication, how we use our bodies and our expressions and noises we might make, like, that's interesting, things like that. What are known as back channeling. And in fact, it's about NASA and how NASA basically learned to use this to figure out who would be good astronauts and who would not be good astronauts. And what's interesting about it is that once you learn to draw your attention to it, you can do it in any format, right? So you're exactly right that if we were together, I would be picking up on some information from you based on your where you're looking, right? Like where you're putting your eyes, how you're moving your hands, because I can't really see your hands. But because I don't have access to that, instead I can focus more on your tone of voice, on the words you're choosing. I can see your face. Oftentimes when the digital communication starts falling apart, it's because we're doing it so fast that we're not thinking anymore. So if you think about it, like there's nothing inherently wrong with sending emails. But the problem is that nowadays, remember when email first came out and like people would actually write each other formal letters on email?
Yeah.
And now it's like, like I email my kids and they're like, okay, bye, right? Like, or it's like, whatever, that's dumb, right? Like we use email as this way to kind of shout at each other. And texting is even worse. In texting, it's like, okay, see you ate, like emoji.
Yeah, you get an emoji now. You're lucky if you can get a word.
You have no idea, right? You have no idea what it means. And I think what's actually happening there is just, it's not that the format is bad. It's not that the channel is corrupt. It's that it allows us to think less. And these lessons that are very intuitive when it comes to speaking to someone face to face, or very intuitive when I can see you, or very intuitive when I'm writing you a letter, like, sitting down and actually editing myself and writing. Those lessons have kind of disappeared when it comes to digital. And all that we need to do is just kind of remind us of them. And in fact, there's this whole guide in there there's these fascinating studies about what to do online. And it's really simple. Like literally, there was this one study looking at Wikipedia that found in almost any conversation where people disagree with each other or fighting, if one person starts saying please and thank you, the amount of conflict goes down by almost half.
Wow.
Because when you think about it, like, if somebody says please or thank you, I mean, as long as they're not like being a jerk about it, right? But like if they're genuinely saying please or thank you, it establishes a norm. And when they don't say please or thank you, when they're like, you're a jerk, that establishes a norm as well.
What does happen in that situation then? Because, for example, I talked to a lot of people who ended up, who worked for Jack Welch back in the day. And Jack Welch, Steve Ballmer, there were a lot of those types of leaders who would scream, who would yell, they would throw things at you. Somebody like a Jack Welch probably never paid attention to what kind of conversation he was having. But if you worked for somebody like a Jack Welch, you knew that you were always going to get into that kind of situation.
Oh, I think Jack Welch paid a lot of attention. I think Steve Ballmer did too.
Really?
There's some people who like who liked those conflict conversations.
Or they just intentionally went for those. Yeah.
Yeah, or I'm trying to send a message to you, which is like this. It has to stop now. Like I'm furious, and like I want to express to you that I'm furious, so you know to take this seriously, because otherwise you might think it's just one of my outbursts. I think that if you look at almost any good leader, the way that they're communicating is very carefully calibrated to what they want their audience to carry away. It's not by accident, whether they yell or whether they ask questions. Some of it is it draws on their personality, but some of it is, what do I want? And by the way, some of those aren't conversations. Sometimes we're in a discussion and we don't want it to be a conversation. When my kids need to clean up their room and I say, do you want to clean your room now? I don't want them to actually have a debate with me about whether they should clean their room.
Yeah.
I'm being polite and telling them to go clean their room. I don't want a conversation, and that's okay. But when it's actually a conversation where we want back and forth, even those people who are yelling, if they are yelling in a conversation, they're probably yelling with someone who understands how to match that yelling, understands how to make sense of that yelling. That yelling is communicating something for them. And frankly, they're probably yelling back.
So what do you do if you are having a conversation with somebody that is, a jerk boss, right? Somebody who is in that mindset of putting you down, who's just, we all know those types of leaders, right? Who's just not giving you the time of day. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, I've identified what kind of a conversation I'm having. This person is like lost their marbles. Do I do anything here? Can I change it into
there's something you can do. There's something you can do.
Conversation. Can we what do I do?
And it's not just in conversations where you think the other person is nuts or gone off the handle. It's also in any conversation where you're having any kind of conflict.
Yeah, heated, tough. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tough conversation. You do this thing called looping for understanding. And study after study has shown this is the most effective technique. Looping for understanding has 3 steps. The first step is ask the person a question. Ask them what they're talking about, like to explain something. The second step is repeat back to them in your own words what you just heard them say. Right? And like, we know we're supposed to do this, but oftentimes we don't. But just deliberately say, look, what I hear you saying is, and repeat back what you just heard. And then number 3, and this is the third step that most people actually overlook, ask them if you got it right. Because what's going to happen when you ask them if you got it right is one of 2 things. Either they're going to tell you no, and you're going to realize, actually, I don't understand what this person is saying. That's why they're so upset, is because I'm not understanding what they're trying to communicate to me. Or number 2, they're going to say, yes, you got it right. And now they know you are listening to them. You have proved that you are listening to them. You're using looping for understanding to show that you want to understand. And then again, this is hardwired into our brain. When we believe someone is listening to us and wants to understand us, it's almost impossible not to listen back.
Can you go over those 3 steps one more time?
Sure. Ask a question.
Okay. So let's say I don't know. Let's say you work for me. You come into the office, and I'm enraged. You did something like, Charles, I can't believe you did this. What the hell's the matter with you? You really let me down. Blah 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 blah.
So Jacob, I hear that you're upset. Can I just ask you one quick question, which is, like, what do you wish I had done differently? Like, just tell me what you think I should have done differently.
Okay.
Okay. And then you would answer that question, and then what I would say is, and I'm not gonna repeat back exactly what you just said. I'm not gonna like parrot you.
Yeah, you told me I'm an idiot, and
yeah, you told me I'm an idiot, and you think that I shouldn't work here, and I don't work hard enough.
It becomes like defensive and arguing at that point.
Exactly. So what instead I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take a second. I'm gonna say, look, what I hear you saying is, you thought that we had a plan to execute on this sale, and it seemed like I didn't execute on that plan. And I think part of that might have been that I didn't understand the plan, but I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. And it sounds like also what you're saying is that this has been really impactful for the company, and now we have to figure out how to make up for this. Okay, that's step 2. I'm going to repeat back what you said to me in my own words. I'm going to process it and let you know what my process is. And then number 3, I'm going to say, did I get that right? Like, am I understanding what you are trying to tell me? That 3rd step is really, really important. And I guarantee you, if you do that with someone who's screaming in your face, when you ask them that question, did I get it right? They're going to start calming down.
Yeah. And even if not screaming, but even if you just don't have clarity in a situation, right? Because
Totally.
I think that's also very, very helpful. And it kind of answers all the questions, right? It removes ambiguity. It gives you clarity on what you should be doing. It addresses maybe any issues that you would have had. So I really like that 3-step approach.
Well, and it does something else, which is that oftentimes the person who's screaming, they don't actually know their own mind particularly well. And so when you say to them, like, did I get that right? They say, no, they could say something like, no, I understand why you might think that, but what I was trying to say was something else. And now they're defining for themselves, they're clarifying for themselves what they're actually trying to get across. I mean, the thing about communication in our own brains is it's really complicated, right? You're literally making dozens and dozens of decisions almost per minute when you're in a conversation. And so it's a hard activity, even though it's something we do every single day. And sometimes we go into a conversation and we don't know what we want to say or how we feel or what we're thinking. And the goal of the conversation is not only to understand the other person, it's to understand ourselves.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, one of the premises of the book is to have what you talk about as far as learning conversations.
Yeah.
And I guess that's exactly a simple way to think about it, right? Even if it's a casual, friendly conversation, is just to kind of take a step back and say, what did I learn about the situation, the person, myself, the conversation? What did I, pick up? Even if it's something small, right?
Yeah. Or even just to set it as a goal.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we go into a conversation and we think of our goal as something like, I want to convince them that I'm right, or I want them to admit that they're wrong, or I want them to agree with my plan. And those are okay goals, but those should be secondary goals because they're very difficult to do unless your first goal is to say, I want to go into this conversation. I want to listen to the other person and understand where they're coming from. And I want to inspire them to listen to me. If your first goal is to have a listening conversation where you are both trying to understand each other, not change each other's minds, not bully each other, not even persuade each other, but just to listen and understand, once you achieve that understanding, all those other things, the convincing, the persuasion, the plan getting, all of that's going to be easier.
Well, let's jump to the Leader's Toolkit section of the podcast where we kind of dive deep into how to put some of these practices into work. And I really like that in the book you had a section where you talk about the before, the beginning, during, as the conversation is unfolding, and you had it broken down into, I think, part 4 of your book called A Guide to Using These Ideas.
Yeah.
And so maybe let's start with before the conversation.
Sure. And I have my copy of the book here, so I'll go ahead and reference
there you go.
As I'm doing
it looks good. My conversation with Charles Duhigg continues, where we are going to talk about how to actually implement some of these ideas of being a super communicator. And specifically, we're going to break this down into 3 sections: what to do before a conversation, what to do at the beginning of a conversation as it's unfolding, and what to do during the conversation. So those kind of 3 different areas there, and how you apply some of these super communicator concepts to make sure that you are having great conversations and that you are being a good communicator. So if you want to get access to that, make sure to subscribe to Great Leadership Plus on Apple Podcasts, and you will get access to one of these episodes every week, as well as ad-free listening. I also encourage you to join the Great Leadership Substack community, which you can do at greatleadership.substack.com. Go to /GL podcast if you want to get 20% off the Substack subscription. If you forget the URL, just email me, jacob@thefutureorganization.com. And you noticed that vulnerability came up in this conversation. Vulnerability comes up in a lot of conversations. And this is why you should grab a copy of my latest book, Leading with Vulnerability. You can do that by going to leadwithvulnerability.com. You can find a copy of the book wherever books are sold. And last but not least, if there's somebody in your life who you would like to see become a better leader, please send them this episode, send them this podcast, share it around, and I appreciate your support. I'll see you next time.